Where we are right now is that you have the Deputy Attorney General, who is Donald Trump's personal lawyer, who is not only saying Trump will not face accountability here, he's saying no one will face accountability, at least in terms of a legal proceeding.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've got Professor Scott Lucas on the show. Of course, he's from the Clinton Institute at the University College Dublin. We're reacting to this Epstein files bombshell that was released late on Friday afternoon. 3.5 million files released by the Department of Justice. Just a reminder that you can watch us every day on the Trump Report YouTube channel, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Scott, you and I have waited a few days to kind of sift through as much as we can. Of course, we can't read 3.5 million files, but we've done as best as we can to give the audience really our reaction, our response. So just to first off, thank you for joining the Trump Report again.
Oh, Maddie, how could I miss starting the week off with y'all? Let's just see if we can get through at least a few 100,000 of these pages before the end of our half hour.
100%. And so over the weekend, just for some context for the audience, on Saturday I had a Professor David K. Johnston on the show to kind of do that reaction less than a day later to these files being released. We went through pretty much just Donald Trump's allegations about Donald Trump in these files, and you and I will kind of break down a little bit more of what's occurred. So just for the audience, on Friday afternoon, the US Department of Justice released a large new batch of Epstein-related records, over 3 million pages, plus thousands of videos and images under the Epstein Files Transparency Act. This was a law that passed by Congress, signed by President Trump at the end of last year. This required the federal government to make it public. Any investigatory files on Epstein, they had to make them public. So, however, the big takeaway, Scott, we knew that the DOJ had 6 million files in their hands. So why hasn't the other 3 million been released?
You better go ask Todd Blanche, who was Donald Trump's personal lawyer, and now in effect is still Donald Trump's personal lawyer, even though he has the title of Deputy Attorney General in the Justice Department. The reason why I say that is, and it's quite interesting, that in terms of the spin since Friday, the Trump administration have not sent out Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, who I think got ourselves into all kinds of trouble going back to the start of last year when saying, oh, yep, here are the Epstein files, I'm reviewing them and so on. They've gone to Blanche, who is a slick operator, very slick. And what he says on Sunday, and I think it cuts to the core, and let me explain why. He gives a presser, and he does the Sunday morning talk shows, which are the big talk shows of the week on U.S. television. And he comes out and says, oh, look, we've released, and in fact, it's around about 2.7 million pages for all that matters. He says, that's it. No more. No more releases. This is all you get. And then he says, oh, there's nothing here about President Trump. There's nothing here, right? And so it's like, okay, they're going to try to cut this off regarding Trump. But then he says, we're not pursuing anybody. There's not enough here to pursue anybody. There's some horrible photographs. Oh, some horrible, horrible photographs. But no, that doesn't make a case. Now, why I'm going to emphasize this is that in part, Blanche was referring over the weekend to the statement that came out from lawyers for the victims. And the victims' response as the lawyers went through the documents is, where is everything? Where are, and you'll hear this term 302s. 302s are documents during a field investigation. When the FBI investigates an allegation, they interview witnesses, they interview the victims, right, to compile whether or not we've got actually a case that needs to be investigated further and maybe eventually prosecuted. And a lot of the victims come out and say, look, we're not seeing the 302s, right? Now, of course, everybody's still combing through the files, but we're not seeing them. And what I found striking is that implicitly, Blanche is not dealing legally here. He's dealing politically. He's coming back after those victims' lawyers and saying, no, nothing else. And you all effectively should just shut up. At a personal level, I find that really harsh. right? But as an analyst, I think it comes back into some questions I'm going to put, and then we can talk about the specific document you went through with David K. Johnston, because I think there's a wider perspective there. But in terms of what is not there, and again, maybe someone hasn't made it through the last few 100,000 documents and all of a sudden it's there. What is not there is not just the 302s. And we're talking about, for example, a lot of your viewers will come at us and talk about the Katie Johnson case. Now, this was the pseudonym for the woman who claimed that she was sexually abused by Trump when she was 13 and took it all the way to filing a criminal case, but it was quickly withdrawn in 2016. And people ever since then have said, well, wait, what's the reality around this? Where are her 302s, right? Where are the 302s, and where are the 302s of people who may have been witnesses in that case? I'll put that out there. But at a broad level, back in December, when the first documents were released, actually more photographs, if you remember, and you and I talked about it, and Ro Khanna, the Democratic congressman, summed it up quite well. He said, where's the 2007 indictment of Epstein in Florida, right? Which was the first time that he was convicted, albeit on a plea bargain, for a reduced sentence. Where's the charging document, which, if I remember correctly, was about 85 pages long, behind the decision to file charges? And that's going to have a great deal of information in it. Where are the documents surrounding the potential co-conspirators? Now, we know there were potential co-conspirators because one of the things that did get out in those initial releases were that at least 10 potential co-conspirators were contacted and were effectively served papers that they might face further investigation and prosecution, right? Where's the further information about them? And I'll just even give you one specific instance, which is one of those moments when you go, wait a minute, red flag, right? Because it's something that is publicly out there. British newspapers picked up on the story that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, who I think is one of the people who had been put out to be targeted to cover for Trump, is that he was going to go over to the island, to Epstein's island, and he was in contact with Ghislaine Maxwell about it. And in the end, he says, I need to spend time with Sarah Ferguson and the kids, right? And Ghislaine Maxwell comes back, look, I understand you need to do that. Redacted. And 5 Russian women, we're just going to have to play with ourselves or have fun with ourselves, something to that effect, right? Yeah, I know how that sounded, right? And I know how Ghislaine meant that to be sounded, but let's get to the core. Who is the redacted person in that email, right? That's a person who potentially was involved. We don't know if they were women below or above the age of consent. We don't know if they may or may not have been trafficked, but there is someone who potentially was one of the clients and involved. If you look at the names that have come out that have gotten the headlines, there's something that's very striking about the first names. And we may talk about them more in detail, but the general point is, back when the photographs came out in December, again, remember, Maddie, the Trump people were pointing the media towards photographs of certain people. Here's Bill Clinton. Here's Michael Jackson. Here's Richard Branson. Wait, here's Bill Clinton again. Oh, Bill Gates. Oh, here's Bill Clinton and Michael Jackson together. And it was even to the point where they falsely were trying to stitch up Bill Clinton and Michael Jackson, because we know what Michael was up to, right? And effectively trying to steer people to say Clinton is the issue here. Here we are, more than a month later. And who are the people whose names have come out in the files? Like Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and the photographs of him with that young woman in a very interesting position. And then Peter Mandelson, former high-level labor advisor, labor minister, then former UK ambassador to the United States, and has now had to resign as a member of the Labour Party because of a very serious revelation. Now, it hasn't been prosecuted, but a revelation involving him and his partner, involving Epstein, which is a financial allegation, by the way, not sexual. And then You could talk about the figures who are the American figures whose names sneak in, but in a very, very limited way. Elon Musk, if you want to call him American rather than South African, had been setting up the possibility of visiting Epstein on one of the islands. Howard Lutnick, who is currently Commerce Secretary, had contact with Epstein after he said he'd cut Epstein off. The most serious allegations probably around Steve Bannon and how close he was to Epstein in 2018, 2019. But except for this one document, this one FBI document, which was a compilation of tips in 2025, nobody's going to look at Trump because there's not the juicy information out there. They're going to be looking at other folks.
The biggest red flag, I guess, from that comment from you, Scott, is that when it comes to these files that haven't been released, these could potentially be the ones with so much more, potentially the worst of it in these 3 million files that haven't been released. So Chuck Schumer, he wrote on X, he said, the American people want the complete truth on the Epstein files, not puffed up statistics. Pam Bondi thinks she can dupe the American people. Americans see right through her lies. Stop the cover up and follow the law. This isn't over. Is your takeaway from the release of these 2.5, potentially 3 million files, Scott, that this is a cover up?
It's a stonewall. And we've been talking about the Trump administration stonewalling this since the start of last year. So what we now have is the largest document dump. Here's the big document dump, and it's combined with the largest stonewall, right? Because of what's been withheld. Let's set out a couple of basics. Let's get to analysis on this. First of all, there are legitimate reasons to withhold documents or heavily redact. We've talked about this before. If you have got an ongoing criminal investigation, you can withhold documents. But remember what Todd Blanche said this weekend? Nothing to see here. There's no charges to be filed. So they can't use that excuse, that pretext. Secondly, if there's a national security implication, and there's a couple of interesting national security stories involved Epstein with Russian money, for example. But, if there's a national security implication, maybe you got a case there. The biggest one probably is look, if you would compromise the security of victims or the security of witnesses, you may need to withhold documents. But the victims themselves are saying that's not what's at issue here. And indeed, they're even saying, look, our names are being revealed here in some cases, whereas the names of the potential perpetrators are being withheld. You cannot claim redaction of a document simply to protect someone against an allegation. You cannot claim that. But remember what was said in December from the Trump people. They said, let it be known, if there were people whose reputations might be damaged because the names came out in the Epstein files, they would withhold. So they're just going to the max here in terms of that, there are a couple names that have kind of snuck out, and I won't give them at this point because it's still minimal in terms of allegations. There are a couple names that snuck out. But beyond that, these, whether they were clients, whether they were men that knew about the trafficking, whether they participated in the trafficking or the abuse, they're being shielded here. Now, let me just tell you, Maddie, and there's an easy answer to this, at least at a starting level. And that is Congress passed the bill demanding full disclosure of the Epstein documents. That's there. So if you are withholding on the grounds that there's a security issue, that there is potential harm to a victim or to a witness, then you bring members of Congress in to review the documents that you have withheld. You give them the rationale for withholding, and at least then you have some level of accountability back to Congress. You do not bring Congress folks in. You are defying accountability, and therefore you are, in my opinion, in violation of the law. And that, I think, is where the next stage of this story goes, rather than a specific, as it were, individual who is on the hook gathering headlines. It's going to be more legal, procedural, and political.
Because what's concerning is those files that haven't been made public. This might not be the worst of it. And that in itself is so concerning that there is more to come, potentially worse allegations than what we've seen. And as you said, Scott, one of the reasons why this took so long is because redactions need to be made to protect witnesses, their safety, their security. And those victims of Epstein have come out, as you mentioned, saying we were not protected after all this time, or after all this time, we were not protected. But there are multiple high profile people named in these documents alleging varying things from being witness to sex trafficking and prostitution and a pedophilia ring to being involved. So Donald Trump is one of the most frequently named high profile people in these files after Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So out of all the things you've read about Donald Trump's alleged involvement, what were your takeaways from this? What did you think was kind of the worst of it?
It's actually, see, this is what's interesting. Although he is cited 5,800 times in the documents, a citation can simply be that Jeffrey Epstein had a newspaper article about Donald Trump, right? Or it could be that there was a reference to, a Trump function or to the Trump campaign. Out of all those 1,500 citations, I've only seen the one major document, which was the one you covered with David K. Johnston, right? And I think the important thing for me is to set that document into context, which I think is the big case that's here. I won't go into the allegations in detail because you did a good job with David on it, and I would ask people to go through it. But we are talking about allegations that include effectively rape, or as well as sexual abuse that involve Trump and other people. The document that summarizes this, and there are multiple cases, came out in August of 2025, because what the FBI is compiling is a record of what they say were tips, and then supposedly the action taken on the tips, right? Now, I find this interesting for a couple of reasons. One is, on the surface, it's like, okay, the FBI is saying, we had the tips, we either tried to call people, they didn't answer, or we found that they weren't credible, or in a couple of cases, we tried to follow up leads. Out of all those tips, there's actually one case, ongoing criminal case, that doesn't arise directly from this, but that is ongoing. And that is it's the Alexander brothers case. These are three brothers, two of whom are very high profile in real estate, who are currently on trial over sexual abuse, including, effectively trafficking, luring women and girls with promises of trips, financial perks to sexually assault them. They are named in one of the tips at being at one of the parties where Trump is supposedly involved as well, right? Now, let me tell you what I want to find interesting about this. One point, which is the first point, is where are the other documents about the investigations when they took place at the time of these tips, right? Because the FBI would have a record of the time. If they had interviewed somebody, there would be a 302. If they had tried to call or follow up, there would be records of them doing that. Where's the paper trail around these very, very serious allegations which are made about abuse of women at parties, trafficking of women at parties, etc.? Where are those supporting documents? Because I haven't seen any supporting documents for it.
Just to interrupt, the allegations that we're talking about against Donald Trump of rape, sexual assault, etc., yes, a lot of them are secondhand testimony on behalf of people, but as you mentioned, they are calling into the FBI, or they are speaking to the FBI. So that reiterates your point that where is the kind of the testimony and the actual phone logs between the FBI and these people?
Yeah, I mean, and the FBI will say, hey, they'll say that most tips they get, in fact, quite often are people who are just relaying something that they think they've heard, or they'll say, look, most tips don't lead to a prosecution. We need to put that out there. But I'm talking about in terms of transparency, right? Where's your investigation of the tips at the time that took place? The second point, beyond the specific on this, goes back to the general question here, which is, look, it is the whole question of accountability in terms of when the release comes out, what is being fed, and it's the timing of this document. They are back on track now. Why August 2025? Why would the FBI in that particular month decide they need to compile a record of tips which happen to have the one common thread of Donald Trump? Was it part of what might be an investigation into Trump? Was it part because someone needed to provide political cover for Trump? So they need to tie up any loose ends, anything that could implicate him. Why this document? Which leads me to a spin-off question from that. Why August 2025? Why did this document get posted initially onto a website and then get withdrawn for a period of time? I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios I could give you here, Maddie. I could say maybe the Trump can't put out this one document, this one key document, potentially going to say, look, none of this is verified. Here you go. This is your document. Now go away. It could be that it was uploaded by mistake, should never have gotten up there, or it could be that someone who doesn't like the way that this is being stonewalled was able to get it through the whole barricade on documentation. I can't give you an answer to any of that. But what I would say probably here is that at this point, we can't establish any of the allegations in the specific document, but we can raise wider questions about this document in terms of the context of what is not out there that might be hidden from us, what is out there where there's political spin to continue to shield a number of people, but in particular Donald Trump.
Well, do you think the DOJ gave Trump the heads up that these allegations would be dropping on Friday?
Oh, I have no doubt about that. I have absolutely no doubt about that because again, we've got to make it clear here that not the career staff of DOJ. They got people who are straight up people who try to work hard. The leadership of DOJ are not there as leaders of an independent agency to serve the American people, which is what the Justice Department is supposed to do. They are there to serve Donald Trump. Pam Bondi, longtime Trump ally, who has protected him in cases when he was in Florida, let alone now at the U.S. level. Todd Blanche, Trump's lawyer, especially in those high-profile felony trial hearings last year. So these folks' first loyalty is to Trump, and I don't care what Blanche said over the weekend. Blanche is there to say, "Oh no, we didn't do anything on behalf of Trump." Absolute rubbish. That was your first port of call, because again, I'll get back to the timing here. February is when Bondi says, "Oh, documents are here. Documents are here. Your files are here, right? Let's review them." Pressure is on ever since then to you should release these. Someone in August, I suspect, says, "Look, we better find out what's serious in these documents. We better find out what's serious, and we better be able to close it down and respond." Now, on Friday, to give you the wider context, I not only think that there was a heads up to Trump on Friday, I think Friday was deliberately chosen. And that's because there was a curious coincidence on Friday. We had two other stories that were in News Cycle on Friday that dropped. First of all, you know the rule, Maddie. If you want something not to get absolute flurry of coverage and traction and so on, you drop on a Friday because reporters are going home for the weekend and they don't want to have to be working weekend. That's just, an age-old trick. But there were two other stories on Friday. One was the Minnesota story, of course, which was still running hot because we still got the question of ICE running roughshod over that state, and we're not getting accountability for the killing of Renee Good or Alex Preddy. But secondly, government shut down on Friday because, again, there was this whole question of whether there would be an extension of government funding. It intersected as to whether the Department of Homeland Security would be funded. So government shutdown on Friday was where a lot of reporters up on Washington were focused on that. And then all of a sudden the files drop, right? So journalists in a way were like, which story are we covering? And it's even up to this point today where you're seeing a lot of the American outlets are not leading with the Epstein story. A lot of them, and I understand this, are going with Minnesota. Some of them are going with the government shutdown. CNN, bizarrely, is going with the Epstein story, but they're going with the angle of how much trouble are the Clintons in over the Epstein, right? And that's because of the side story that the Republicans trying to divert from Trump are trying to get Bill and Hillary Clinton to testify. And when they wouldn't testify, they're trying to get him for contempt of Congress. And I'm like, CNN, do your job. Right? The Clintons are not the story.
Scott, you're absolutely right. Of course, he's the president of the United States, so he's always going to be the focus of this story if he's named. But this was the former president. I'm not backing CNN here, but I'm saying that Bill Clinton has a lot to answer for, a lot. But I want to move on because we've got so much to discuss.
Well, no, Maddie, let me, because you got to remember, I'm Clinton Institute, not Clinton Foundation.
I know.
I'm just coming back on this. I'm saying certainly you mentioned Bill Clinton in your coverage here, but that CNN coverage was Trump is dropped way down on here, and all of a sudden it's like, well, Bill and Hillary Clinton here, and I'm going, okay, look, you should be covering at least both sides of this story and not going hard on the Clintons as your lead at this point.
And on that note, Scott, I mean, just for the context of the fact that these files were dropped after the Epstein Transparency Act was passed in December, when you listen to testimony, because they were under oath when they were speaking about this, you see Republican Thomas Massey, Democrat Ro Khanna, they were the co-sponsors of this act. They introduced the act last year. The motive, and they speak about this under oath, the motive was to expose powerful individuals involved in Epstein's sex trafficking and pedophilia ring. They don't care what side of politics these people are. They don't even need to be involved in politics. They can be working in a bank. They can be a former prince. They can be anyone. But their whole thing that they have said is that rich and powerful people involved in Epstein's criminality need to be held accountable. Victims need to know that even the rich and the powerful will be prosecuted for crimes. But the takeaway from my interview with David K. Johnston and what you and I have spoken about off air is that these people probably won't be investigated or prosecuted.
Let's see. Okay. What I'm going to say is, having just mentioned Clinton, let's be very clear here. Bill Clinton was a powerful man. If Bill Clinton abused that position to abuse young women, he should be accountable. There is no party line on this. If you get businessmen of whichever business they're in, who abuse these women, they should be accountable. You get people in the, whoever the celebrities are, entertainment industry, media, they should be accountable. That should be your line to start with, wherever you are in this investigation. Where we are right now is that you have the Deputy Attorney General, who is Donald Trump's personal lawyer, who is not only saying Trump will not face accountability here, he's saying no one will face accountability, at least in terms of a legal proceeding, as a result of these files. Now, there will be other people who are having to be accountable elsewhere. I think there have been repercussions in the UK for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, for Peter Mandelson. There has been, I remember if it's Slovakia, Slovenia, there has been a government minister in one of the Central European countries, Slovakia, I believe, who's had to resign because of this. There has been George Mitchell, the former high-level U.S. envoy, the Good Friday Agreement, who has who's been removed from a U.S. Ireland education panel. So there will be people who will be held accountable in different ways. But at the highest level, in terms of a federal prosecution, no one, zero. Now, how do you go back to those women who were there when we were wondering whether the accountability bill would be passed, and who told their stories in front of Capitol Hill, who had suffered this abuse when they were girls, and years later are still seeking closure, and they're brave enough to come out and talk about it? How do you face them, right? And let me just close it. Todd Blanche will not have to face these women individually. He won't, right? Pam Bondi will not have to face these women individually. They won't. Donald Trump, and I now will say this because there is context that's important here, whether or not Trump actually is held accountability in the Epstein files or should be accountable, Donald Trump has been convicted of a serious sexual assault that was tantamount to rape in a civil case. He was convicted of defamation, but effectively he was found to have committed a serious sexual assault tantamount to rape of E. Jean Carroll in the 1990s. He has been accused of multiple women of sexual, at best, sexually accosting them. Some might say sexual assault. He has bragged on camera about sexually accosting women. He will never have to face any of these women. I hope that at some point there may be a change in administration. I hope even during this administration that Congress will get a backbone and pursue this as far as they can. Because at some point, those women need to be looked in the eyes by someone who says, we have heard your stories and we have not tried to bury them. We will try to honor you by making sure that accountability and justice are pursued. I wait for that day.
Scott, just a final question. Elon Musk's involvement has been quite interesting in the last few days, as he's been highly critical of any high profile or any person involved with Jeffrey Epstein. The files, however, claim that Elon Musk was in attendance at parties with Epstein, that he was at one of the Calendar Girls party at Mar-a-Lago, which was where Trump allegedly was auctioning off girls. And I just want to reiterate for the audience that nothing in these files shows proof or evidence of Trump or Elon Musk or anything. These are allegations. I just want to say that these are allegations. But emails in 2012 to 2013 between Musk and Epstein shows Elon Musk actually quite eager to party at Epstein Island. There's no evidence that Musk ever attended these parties, went on Epstein's plane, or went to Epstein's Island, but the emails do show a closer relationship between the two than what he has put out to the world. So he is still denying any involvement in Epstein's creepy sex trafficking ring. But the question is, well, let me read out this email first. Basically, Epstein says in 2012, "You're welcome to come and just stay, or come for the day. I'll send the helicopter to you." He says, "Do you have any parties planned? I've been working to the edge of sanity this year, and so once the kids head home after Christmas, I really want to hit the party scene in St. Bart's or elsewhere and let loose. The invitation is much appreciated, but a peaceful island experience is the opposite of what I'm looking for." Epstein replies, "Understood. I'll see you in St. Barth. The ratio on my island might make Tallulah uncomfortable," which is, of course, Musk's ex-wife. But I think the question is, Musk still on X is claiming that Jeffrey Epstein hounded him to go to Pedo Island, to which people are obviously commenting back saying, well, the emails would suggest that you were hounding him to go to Epstein Island. But I think my question to you is, Scott, is, did he have knowledge of what was going on Epstein Island? And did he know the extent of allegations against Trump? Because, of course, when they had this fallout, he said Trump's in the Epstein files, mic drop, blah, blah, blah. That's why they haven't been released. If he knew about allegations about Donald Trump, whether or not they're true, we don't know. Or if he knew what was going on at Epstein Island and knew and didn't say anything, he's complicit because he hasn't said anything of what was going on. He's also lied about the extent of their relationship. But if he knew about what was going on with Trump, about these allegations, he still decided to funnel millions of dollars into his 2024 campaign.
Look, on the specifics here, and this is where, if you're an analyst, you have to hold up your hands and say, we don't know, okay? All we know, which is now on record, is precisely that Elon Musk and Jeffrey Epstein were in contact in that period you're talking about, which importantly is after Epstein's first conviction in Florida, right? And Musk is talking about going out to the island. Now, whether or not Musk knew about the activities that took place in the island, he would have, I would have assumed, know about Epstein's conviction, which had taken place a few years earlier. Because just let me double check, Maddie, this is 2012, 2013, correct? Yeah. And Epstein, the conviction is by 2009. So he certainly knows about that. I would assume that unless Elon Musk was completely isolated in all his tech ventures, he would have known that Donald Trump was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein and had connections with Jeffrey Epstein up until at least 2004. But beyond that, I can't tell you what goes on in terms of that. And to be honest with you, Maddie, I think in a way this is one of those questions where if we start to speculate, we lose track of the bigger thing that takes place here, because it's not just about Elon Musk. There are a whole series of individuals who are in the financial community, who are in the media, who are in politics, who are in contact with Epstein after that 2009 conviction. They cannot plead ignorance of what took place there, even if they don't know the specifics of what's going on in the island. And this, of course, is where, although again, I don't want him to be the only headline, because there's a risk, there's a diversion there. But it's where Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and his former wife, Sarah Ferguson, come to, because, they're publicly saying, oh, we're not going to have anything to do with this man for this conviction. And quite clearly they are.
Scott, to interrupt, just for the audience, Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and Harvey Weinstein were invited to his daughter's 18th birthday, even after he'd been convicted.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, you take someone like another case. You know, someone who we mentioned, Steve Bannon is one of the Trumpists who does come into frame here. Look, Trump, Bannon in 2018, 2019. So this is not only after the Florida case. This is in the lead up to the New York case, the one where finally Epstein is put away for a number of years. Bannon and Epstein are very, very close in emails, and Epstein's making travel arrangements for Bannon when Bannon needs it at certain points. But then Bannon comes in after there's a very critical documentary about Epstein in early 2019, months before he finally is convicted and goes to prison. Bannon comes in to work with Epstein on a documentary to make him look good and to coach him on media appearances. For example, for 60 Minutes, the CBS flagship program in the United States. And so there was a video that dropped day before yesterday, and the headline was, "Oh, Epstein says, are you as bad as the devil?" Right? And it's all about whether Epstein had ethical concerns about the people who he had provided financial consultancy for. That's not the takeaway there. The takeaway there is the interviewer who you don't see. That's Steve Bannon. They are doing those interviews, in effect, to coach Epstein in terms of replies, to put out his side of the story. Now, Bannon is someone who, although he is not part of the Trump administration, is still part of the Trump camp. And he's someone who right now is trying to promote hard right political parties to take power. It's not just in the US, but in Europe and in the UK, right? So, he can't plead ignorance of this as well. So there is that immediate level of accountability in terms of people who possibly should be prosecuted for what they involved. But then there's another level of accountability, which is the social accountability. And I would include Bill Clinton in this as well, right? And that is, this man, you can't plead ignorance, at least after 2007, 2008, 2009. Donald Trump cannot plead ignorance that he did not know that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were recruiting women out of Mar-a-Lago. He can't plead ignorance on that. Where's your social accountability for what this took place? And I'm struck by one thing, Maddie, which maybe people don't talk about anymore. If we'd had this conversation in 2014, when the allegations were carving out against Harvey Weinstein, right, who is also connected to Epstein, we would have been talking about the Me Too movement. And the whole point about the Me Too movement is that women were heard, that women were, but also that there was a political culture which actually recognized that this type of abuse of women could not be excused, could not be tolerated, could not be covered up. Guess where we are in 2026? Where certain people who are in very powerful positions believe that women can be abused without their voices being heard, without their cases being recognized. These can be covered up, and therefore people don't have to pay any price for it.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report for that. A great analysis of really what's been going on the last few days. There's, as I've mentioned, millions of documents to go through. It's impossible to really talk about every single one in an interview, but we've done our best. But we'll get you back on as kind of this story develops. So thank you for joining the Trump Report again.
Thank you so much, Maddie.